Hello and welcome to Pickles Garage. Today we're going to be working on the steering box on my 1923 T-Bucket. We're aiming for a bit tighter steering, a bit more intuitive, something that you trust a little bit more. Part of the issue that I have with this thing is one, it's manual steering, and sometimes it's a little suggestive. It's not very direct. You're not really pointing and shooting. That is pretty typical with a lot of these older hot rod style vehicles, but naturally when it starts getting worse and worse and worse and you don't know if it's going to go the direction you're pointing, it gets a little concerning. A lot of the time what I honestly have to do is you kind of have to slide the rear end a little bit just to get a little bit sharper of turning, which in itself is dangerous if there's any issues that you have with doing that. So we're going to try and get some tighter steering, and this should be fairly universal for a lot of different steering boxes, but we'll go ahead and start diving right into it. So with a lot of these hot rods, they're kind of cobbled together with a lot of different parts. This naturally kind of looks like it would be a kit car. It is titled as a 1923, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a bunch of parts from other things. For example, the steering box, which is mounted under the dash here, is actually the 1933 or 1934 Ford steering box. That's very common with these. It has a 15-to-1 ratio. That way, there's not a lot of wheel turning that you have to do just to get to the wheels all the way, one way or the other. So 15-to-1 real quick, what that means is the ratio is 15 degrees of turning of the steering wheel is 1 degree of turning of the actual wheel. So you'll notice having that sort of lower number is pretty typical with power steering, just because you can get away with doing that. But if you have that lower ratio, 15 or even 12 in some cases, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to actually turn the wheels. If you have a high ratio, or like a high number for that ratio, it's a lot easier. And that does have to do a little bit with the size of the wheel. A lot of the time you can get away with a different or a lower ratio number if you have a bigger wheel, which 1933 probably had a pretty big wheel. But this being the combination of manual steering, small wheel, and that low ratio number, it does make this pretty hard to turn. So that is kind of why we're going to be a little bit more aggressive on keeping this dialed in, which I imagine you might be having a similar issue. So you'll notice there's a fair amount of play, and you might be thinking that maybe that is related to the wheel itself, because there's a number of different things, right? There's the connection of the wheel to the shaft here. There's all the internals of the worm gear on the inside, and then there's this sort of coupling here that goes onto the spline. So there's the potential for a lot of play. There's also this out here, this mounting point. So basically I would run through and just see how everything is reacting. Nothing going on, there's no play there, there's no play here. And like I said, you might be considering that it might be the wheel, but if you take it off, there's not really gonna be a lot of play in that at all. So what we know is there's definitely an adjustment to be made here. So in this process, there's going to be a series of adjustments that we're going to be making. So we're going to see what is loose and then kind of go from there. So unfortunately, I'm not a very good artist, but I want to kind of put into context here. So this would be a sort of a worm gear, and what it is it's sort of corkscrewing around, right? And then you have this, which this dark spot is actually like a shaft, right? The long shaft. And it has these sort of notches in it, and that will rest on top of this. And as this turns this direction, right, it's moving that sort of corkscrew and vice versa, right? So that's the general concept. So if there's play, it's because this isn't fully seated on these threads. And so that's what we're going to be looking into right now. So as we saw, there was play in the actual shaft itself on the steering, but we can also check it at the wheel too, and you'll see that there's play. And with our masking tape, we're able to actually see how much the wheel, like the steering wheel, is moving in relation to this. And so this sort of just validates that it's the entire system and it's not something only upstream. So now that we've confirmed that, we're going to go ahead and work on the adjustment with getting the gearing a little bit closer to the actual worm gear. Okay, so for this adjustment, I loosened all of these, right? And then now we're going to tighten clockwise this outside nut. And basically that is just pushing at a different angle a cone in there, and that should be snugging everything up. Now let me get a better size for this. Okay, so you could use like a 22, or I guess like probably a 3/4 in this case, but we're just gonna do a little bit here for adjustment. Nothing too crazy. All right, and now we've eliminated the play, so you see this doesn't turn anymore. And let me do a tiny bit more, just a tiny bit. And then we'll go ahead and put our nut back on. And then we're gonna check it. So 9/16 on all these. Now we're just gonna make sure that there's no binding. So I'm gonna tighten all these and make sure zero binding. And so you wanna make sure you snug everything back up, otherwise it won't give you the appropriate feel. But you'll remember how much play I had, and I moved it barely a millimeter, and now I have no play at all. So you wanna turn the wheel, make sure there's no binding. If it's tighter on one side, you're gonna have to adjust some other components here, which I'll go over here in a second. So now that you've made the adjustment and this no longer has any play here, you're going to want to check that everything is centered in a different way, right? So they're centered here, and then they're centered here. And so the way to check that is you're going to have the wheel straight, right? And you're gonna check the play, and you'll see that the wheel is pretty solid here. There's really not play. I mean, this is gonna be pitman arm more than anything. That's just has a tiny bit of give. But then if you turn a little bit to the right, I don't have a whole lot of radius here, so that is more than enough here. And you're gonna check the play here. You'll see there's quite a bit of give here. See the wheel's moving a little bit, right? And then if we turn it the other direction, right, I can already feel that it's tighter in my hand. And the wheel isn't moving at all. There's still that give, but that's really just pitman arm give. And so you can feel that this is now tighter in one direction than the other. And so the additional adjustment that you're gonna make is we're gonna loosen the bolts again, and then we're going to be tightening this one right here, or we're gonna be adjusting this one right here. Now, in my case, it's more loose when I'm turning right, and so that adjustment is actually going to be clockwise on this. If it was more loose turning left, then it's going to be counterclockwise. So once again, I'm going to undo 9/16 on these bolts. I'm going to make that adjustment, and then we're going to snug everything up, and then we're going to test the steering again, and then we might need to make an additional adjustment here now that it's recentered. So as mentioned, you might have to toy with this one a little bit. Again, I think I moved it a 0.5 millimeter. It is such a fine adjustment. But after I made this adjustment, I think it went from basically this position to more or less straight down. And then this was a 0.5 millimeter more. And now I have equal steering, both directions, feels exactly the same. Feels great. I'm going to check from the wheels and just do that same sort of test while looking at my mark and make sure that it feels the same from that angle as well, but it very much should. And as you'll see, there is no more play right here. The only play I now have is genuinely the steering wheel, and I just need to secure that down. So that is a perfect adjustment here. So now we can move to this side, and then you're also going to see this right here. Now, all this is a bolt that is going, where's my finger? This way, right? Into the internals. And so essentially making that adjustment, which is a 22 retaining nut, right? And then you're just gonna use a screwdriver. And all that is pushing they bolt inward this way, and so there's not play with the actual pitman arm moving in that direction. And so it's a lot easier if it's disassembled on a bench to just kind of pull on it and then just wait until there's no play and then, you know, back it off slightly so you're not over tightened. But you could do it in this way too. It does create a little bit of drag, and so if you were looking for tighter steering and all the other adjustments were done correctly, then that would give you a little bit of tighter steering if you had play kind of downstream, right? The only thing with that is you don't want to over tighten it, or if you're only going to tighten that and nothing else and you don't make any other adjustments, it could press in and damage the worm gear. So you do want to be careful. Dab will do you the slightest turn will give you everything you need, but it will ultimately give you a little bit of tighter steering, again, downstream. And that wraps it up. So, like I said, check from both the shaft here and the wheel just to kind of verify the area that you're having the most issues. You know, this steering wheel is still loose, but now the shaft is perfectly stable. Super high level. You're going to go for that top one for the sort of up and down centering, which will have this be very loose if it's not snug to it. And then that lower part is centering from this direction. So if it's tighter steering one way versus the other, that is the adjustment there. And then the final nut on this side is going to be just making sure everything is snug in the housing. And, you know, little by little, just do mild adjustments here and there. Check, make sure you have full range of motion without binding. Masking tape helps just to verify that when you're adjusting the wheel, the steering wheel is going with it. But that is all you need to do. So thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Feel free to like and subscribe.